Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance. Amid accusations of government censorship, a federal judge has now limited the Biden administration's communications with social media companies. NTD's Iris Tao has more from the White House.
The Biden administration is now restricted from calling, emailing, or meeting with social media companies. That's according to a latest order by a Trump-appointed judge named Terry Doughty, who on Tuesday granted a preliminary injunction blocking federal agencies, including the FBI, the CDC, and the Justice Department, from asking social media companies to delete or suppress content, quote, containing protected free speech. And today, the White House responded by saying that it's against the ruling.
We certainly disagree with this decision. We are going to continue to promote responsible actions to protect public health, safety, and security when confronted by challenges like a deadly pandemic and foreign attacks on our elections.
The ruling comes after the Republican attorney generals of Louisiana and Missouri sued the Biden administration last year, alleging that it has colluded with social media platforms to suppress information and posts about COVID-19 policies and election integrity. But while the Biden administration insisted that such communication is needed to help the platforms tackle misinformation, the judge ruled in his ruling, quote, evidence produced thus far depicts an almost dystopian scenario, adding that the government seems to have acted like an Orwellian ministry of truth during the COVID-19 pandemic.
This could be arguably one of the most important First Amendment cases in modern history.
One of the plaintiffs, the Attorney General of Louisiana, told the Epoch Times this week that the latest ruling here could start curtailing government activities on free speech.
Things that we uncovered in this case should be both shocking, appalling, and concerning for all Americans.
Meanwhile, the latest order here still permits the Biden administration to talk to and communicate with social media companies about national security threats and criminal activities. And it's important to note that the preliminary injunction is not a final ruling, and the Biden administration's Justice Department is expected to appeal it. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt is the co-plaintiff who brought the lawsuit against the Biden administration last year. This was while he was the Attorney General of Missouri. He now joins us to discuss the significance of the court's decision. Senator Eric Schmitt, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Senator, the preliminary injunction has been granted in the Missouri versus Biden case, very high stakes case, which you brought forth as Attorney General at the time of Missouri. If you could explain exactly what this means and how significant it might be.
Yeah, it's a big win for the First Amendment, and it's a big blow to censorship. I mean, I think that's the best way to describe the injunction. But if you take a step back for the lawsuit, which we filed last year when I was Attorney General, it essentially exposed this vast censorship enterprise between the government colluding with some of the most powerful companies in the history of the world to suppress speech. And that violates the First Amendment. The judge saw it that way. And I think if you take a step back, the First Amendment is just such an important piece of what it means to celebrate our freedoms as we did on the 4th of July here in the United States. And people ought to be able to express themselves. And the government doesn't have any business in moderating content. They just don't. It violates the First Amendment, and they don't get to outsource that either to big tech companies. And that's what this case is all about.
So, Senator, if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit on some of your biggest, or I guess deepest concerns when you saw this possible censorship and where it would ultimately lead or did lead to.
Well, we saw it in a number of examples. The origins of COVID with the lab leak. I mean, they were actively working to censor people who had a different point of view than Anthony Fauci, who knew very well that he was funding the Wuhan lab, but didn't want it to come back on him. We took the deposition of Anthony Fauci. The Hunter Biden laptop, we took the deposition of the FBI agent, Elvis Chan, who was having monthly, then weekly meetings with senior big tech executives, warning them about a hack and leak operation, even though they already had the Hunter Biden laptop. And certainly saw this play out over COVID, where anybody who had a different point of view on efficacy of masks or you name it, they were being censored. And the government was flagging this and colluding with and coercing big tech companies to censor that kind of speech and deplatform people. And that was exposed. The judge saw that and issued an injunction to say, you can't do that anymore. You cannot work with these companies in that way because it violates the First Amendment.
Senator, a process question, I guess this might be. Some may be wondering, now that you're a United States Senator and no longer Attorney General of Missouri involved with this case, does this affect the case at all? Where does it go from here? Perhaps the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so the Missouri Attorney General's office is still actively engaged in this, along with the Louisiana Attorney General, Jeff Landry. So they're continuing to work on this case, which is great. And I think that probably what will happen, I mean, we'll see, but the government will likely appeal the ruling to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And this case, my point of view is that this is destined for the Supreme Court of the United States, because it's such a big issue and touches such an important sort of fundamental principle of the country embodied in the First Amendment, is that protected free speech, that it ought to go there. If I mean, I would like to just win now and nobody appeals, but that's probably not how this is going to play out. And look, between this and the Twitter files, this has exposed that, like I said, a vast censorship enterprise that has worked to suppress speech of millions of Americans, and it's wrong.
So lastly, there are certain things that are not prohibited by this injunction, such as still allowing communication between social media companies and the government over criminal activity or, say, national security threats. This also connects, I think, to a greater question, as we've seen play out with some of the Supreme Court rulings as well as of late, of jurors' prudence in the broad interpretation of laws and the Constitution. How do we get back to interpreting the law in a way it was initially intended in an age of so much subjectivity?
Well, you're speaking my language here. I think that this is a very important concept, that the court's job isn't to make policy. The court's job is to interpret the laws as they've been written and apply them. And I think what you see right now with the Democrats and the moderate left is they're beside themselves and unhinged that the Supreme Court, is no longer going to advance a progressive agenda and be a super legislature. That's not what the court's role is. The court's role is to say, hey, look, Joe Biden, you don't have any authority to wipe away $500 billion worth of student loan debt. You can like that policy, dislike that policy, but the truth is the law doesn't allow you to do it. And that's why you lose on the student loan debt forgiveness scam. I think we got to get back to that, where the court is interpreting the law as it's written, not how they want it to be.
Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt, thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime. Take care.
It appears as though the Biden administration is eager to patch up relations with China, today sending the second cabinet member in less than a month's time to meet with Chinese Communist Party officials. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has more on the purpose of the trip and the broader geopolitical issues at play.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is visiting China for the next few days. Yellen is trying to work out economic relations between the two largest economies in the world. This trip comes amid new tensions between Beijing and Washington over export controls. National Foreign Trade Council President Jake Colvin described the trip as one that's expected to help define a quote-unquote new normal. Yellen's trip is part of the Biden administration's plan to deepen communications with China, but some doubt its effectiveness. Here's what Congressman Mike Gallagher, who is the chairman of the Select China Committee in the House, told me just ahead of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to China just a few weeks ago.
The attempts by the administration to revive engagement after it's failed for 20 years, I just don't know what that achieves, other than to force us to slow walk certain defensive actions, i.e. sanctions on key CCP officials related to the ongoing genocide. We have to figure out a way to reclaim our economic independence, to stop funding our own destruction, and to take the golden blindfolds off when it comes to the risks of doing business with Beijing, which we've seen again for 20 years.
But Yellen is expected to tell her Chinese counterparts that the U.S. does not intend to decouple the two economies. But this is tricky because the U.S. still intends to protect human rights and protect national security. And although Yellen is mainly meant to focus on economic relations, she's expected to also warn CCP officials of the consequences they face if they do provide lethal aid to Russia. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
And over a dozen people dead after multiple shootings across the country leading up to the July 4th holiday. The suspect in the most deadly of those shootings was charged with murder this afternoon. And the White House today commenting on these tragedies.
The White House on Wednesday afternoon addressing shootings that took place this week. The president wants Republican lawmakers
to come to the table and ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, to require safe storage of guns, to end gun manufacturers, immunity from liability, and to enact universal background checks. Lives are at stake here, folks.
The U.S. saw multiple shootings this week, leaving more than a dozen dead and almost 60 wounded. The deadliest of those shootings took place in Philadelphia on Monday night. The suspect, 40-year-old Kimbrady Carricker, allegedly killed 5 men and injured 2 children, one of them only 2 years of age. He was charged with 5 counts of murder, attempted murder, and more on Wednesday afternoon. Here you see pictures of the suspect reportedly shared on Facebook. Reports allege he's a Black Lives Matter supporter who used to wear female clothes at times. Philadelphia's district attorney on Wednesday told CNN it's unclear how the suspect obtained his weapons. Take a look.
There is good reason to believe that his purchase of the AR and his either manufacture or purchase of a ghost gun, which of course are not sold through official vendors, there's good reason to think that it may have been obtained illegally.
In a different incident in Louisiana, at least 3 people were killed and 10 others wounded late Tuesday night. No arrests have been made. In Washington, D.C. on Wednesday morning, a dark SUV drove by a crowd of people, opening fire. No one died, but at least 9 were wounded, among them a 9 and a 17-year-old. No arrests have been made, but police say the shooting was targeted. Luis Valdez, a member of Gun Owners of America, previously told NTD that guns aren't the problem with shootings.
The problem is very simple. We have a mental health crisis where people with debilitating issues that should be seeking treatment have been swept under the rug. And worse, we have a revolving door criminal justice system in which hardened criminals who should be behind bars are given slaps on the wrist and let loose in society.
He says that prosecutors in some cities aren't necessarily putting people behind bars in many cases.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.